So last week we started this riveting Old Testament study on Leviticus. It's kind of based in Leviticus 23. Many of you were very polite. I appreciate that. I got some nice comments like, it's so nice that you enjoy this subject so much. And, somebody said, maybe you wouldn't have to share all of the information that you're gathering. That's cute. Trust me, this is not even close to all of the information that I'm gathering. But I am going to share enough so that anyone that will follow along can start to get a sense of the magic of this whole thing. All right, so this is a study of the Moedim of God, or the appointed times of the Lord. So 3 of these festivals were already established when we get to Leviticus 23. They're the Passover, weeks, and tabernacles. And these are the 3 that end up being pilgrimage holidays. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And then God added 4 appointments in this passage in Leviticus. And so we're going to study all 7 of them in some detail. We're going to go through these feasts in the order that God put them on the calendar that God started. And that means that we're starting with the Passover. All right, so I know that all of you who were here last week were really hoping to hear some more of that same stuff again. So we're going to start with a super brief review. I promise it'll be brief. I'm going to wait. Somebody's going to get up and leave. I know that's going to happen. But all right, so this list is all 7 of the appointments in order. And the ones in italics are the original 3 that become the annual pilgrimages. And you'll remember that we added at the end of last week a picture of this special 7-branched menorah that God had the Hebrews make just for burning in the tabernacle and then in the temple. And we talked about the fact that it can be used as a map or a timeline to help remember how these feasts are arranged. And so the first 3 appointments are all in the first month of the year, Nisan. And so some of the text or places in the Bible or websites say that this is the month of Aviv. So that's still right, but it's a little bit less precise wording. Aviv is the season. Nisan is the name of the month. And in the original language, it's not at all incorrect to say that the first month of a season is the month of the season. So it would be a little bit like us saying that the month of spring is the month of April. All right, so I know that spring starts in March, but it's pretty close to the end of March. All right, but that's what's going on when you see these different names. And so the name of the month is Nisan. All right, and then all alone in the middle, that's 50 days after first fruits, is the Feast of Weeks, which has nothing to do with food and only takes 1 day. All right, and so then there are the last 3, all grouped together in the month of Tishri. So that's their 7th month. And last week we did a whole bunch of background and explanation. And I'm going to reference those explanations, but I'm not going to redo any of them. And so if you were not here last week, then you can try to listen to the audio of the teaching. If you were here last week, then I'm going to try not to punish you for the same crime twice. Okay, you've done your time. We're going to move on. All right, so this week is Passover. This is the very easiest of these appointments to claim that it's predictive. All right, so pastors and scholars have been drawing connective lines between the God-prescribed observance of Passover and the final week of the life of Jesus almost since right after Jesus ascended. Okay, and so I think that most Christians have at least a vague sense that the Passover was God kind of preparing people and informing people and instructing people in what the coming Messiah would do and what it would look like. And so we get the idea that it was sort of like a shadow of the coming Messiah. And that's true. All right, but I have become convinced that these Moedim are more than that. So this word translates, we said, to appointed times. They are times that are appointed by God. And they are appointments with God. And maybe They are appointments that Jesus intends to keep with us. All right, so this is John D. Garr, PhD, THD, whatever, all right? He's the founder and the president of the Restoration Foundation. It's a Hebraic Christian community, and so this is his take on these appointments. It says, the 7 festivals were designed by God to be appointments, the primary meaning of the Hebrew word moedim, which is generally translated as festivals or feasts in English. Since the word moedim can also be translated as rehearsals, it's also clear that the festivals were times for God's people to prepare for events that were still in the future. The 7 festivals are appointments that God has set on his calendar for meeting with his people. At the same time, they are rehearsals that point to the unfolding of messianic prophecy. That is such a cool idea, I think, right? And we're going to go with it, okay? These moedim are appointments with God, and they're also rehearsals for the future. So this is our passage. This is Leviticus 23. And as much as I know that you all want to go through the whole chapter again, before we come back to this verse, we don't really have time this morning. So I'm just going to read these 2 verses. These are the Lord's appointed festivals, the sacred assemblies you are to proclaim at their appointed times. The Lord's Passover begins at twilight on the 14th day of the first month. So there it is, right? The rehearsal and the appointment that we're going to talk about today. And he reminds them that this appointment is set for the 14th day of Nisan. And it's not at evening, but at twilight, which is yet another word that was poorly chosen in translation, I think. We did a bunch of those last week. We're going to establish the accurate meaning of that word a little bit later. So here's what we're going to do today. We're going to do a quick recap of the actual Passover event, right? Like while the Jewish people were in captivity in Egypt. We're going to briefly describe some ways that the Bible said that the Passover should be memorialized. And in that same discussion, we will probably talk about some things that got added or subtracted along the way without God saying to do that. Then we're going to look at what we need to know about what the Passover was like in the time of Christ. And so what was Passover like for Jesus and the disciples? So then we're going to compare the Passion Week of Christ to God's instructions for the rehearsal of that event to see just what God may have been trying to show us. And then we're going to look at the places that I have tuned the generally accepted timeline and why I would do that. All right, and so if you were here last week, then this is going to be just as awesome, but with a little bit more payoff. And I may really upset you by the time we get done with this one. If you were not here last week, enjoy the ride, okay? If this is your first time visiting or checking us out, well then, I wish it had worked out. I hope you find a great church. All right. All right. The original Passover event is our background for this one, right? Duh. Okay, so the Hebrew people have been in Egypt for 430 years. They were not slaves the whole time, but they've been slaves for a good while at this point. And so they don't really seem to remember not being slaves. But between God and Moses, they're planning to get the nation of Israel released from bondage. And to that end, God has put the nation of Egypt, and to some degree, the Jews also, through 9 plagues. But, the resolve of Pharaoh hasn't relinquished, and it did waver a little bit at times, but he's not letting them go. And this Passover event is the 10th plague that God intends to be the big one that destroys the resolve of the Egyptians. So we're going to take a look at Exodus 12 for just a minute. So God is telling Moses and Aaron how to tell the Hebrew people how to prepare for this plague that's coming. And it says, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, this month is to be for you the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. You are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. That same night they are to eat the meat roasted over a fire, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or boiled in water, but roasted over a fire with the head, legs, and internal organs. Do not leave any of it until morning. If some is left until morning, you must burn it. This is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. All right, so that's it. We're going to pull a couple of details out of this thing. So back in the first few verses, God says that on the 10th day of Nisan, each man is to select a lamb for their family. And the word that is used for lamb is appropriate for a young sheep or a young goat. And I think he said that. All right. And the animal needs to be without defect. And so we usually read this to mean that the lamb has to be perfect. That's not really wrong. But the point is that it can't have something wrong with it. You can't take the three-legged gimp lamb with one ear and a mangy coat and sacrifice it to God. All right? That's the lamb no one wants anyway. You have to give the good one to God. All right, it says that the family needs to take care of the lamb until the 14th day of Nisan. And just for the record, most houses and places where people lived didn't really have barns and animal pens and stuff. And so they generally kept these lambs in their house. All right, and then they're to come together at twilight to slaughter the lambs. And so we're still going to pull this word apart in just a minute. Then in every house that is eating some of the lamb, they're supposed to put some of the lamb's blood on the sides and the top of the door frames. And that same night, they need to roast the sacrificed lamb over a fire in the house and eat every bit of it or burn whatever's left. And so for us, this same night would be the night with the same date. It would be the night of the 14th day of Nisan. For them, this would be after evening and after sunset. So this would be the next date, right? Does that make sense? So this would be the start of the 15th day of Nisan for them. And so let's see if we can put this stuff on some kind of a timeline that makes some sense so that we can elaborate on it for later. All right, this is Passover week. It has a couple too many days. We'll use those later. This goes from the 10th day of Nisan to the 17th, and the days are intended in this diagram to be divided like hours are, starting at and ending at midnight. All right, so that way it's easiest for us to understand, I think. Anyway, the 10th is the day that every family selects their lamb. Technically, it looks like the man selects the lamb for his family. Then on the 14th day of Nisan, everybody gets together and they kill their lamb with edged implements or sharp sticks or whatever. And the lamb that you select has to be a good one. All right, it has to be unblemished and without defect. And so for 4 days, there's this lamb probably living in your house, and the family's caring for it. And later, this 4 days is taken to mean that, you're making sure that the lamb does not have any defects that you didn't see at first. But there's something else that happens with a young lamb living directly among a family for this period of time. So on the 10th, when you select it, it's a lamb. But by the 14th, this is your lamb. You see what I mean? By the time you have to kill this lamb, you're attached to it. May even have a name. Okay, you identify with the lamb. You'll try not to identify with it and become attached to it, but it's still going to happen. All right, and so in this 4 days of observing and checking for defects, you become emotionally attached to your lamb. And then at twilight on the 14th, we all get together and we sacrifice our lambs. And so you'll notice that generally the Bible uses the word evening when it means sundown. Okay, and so this word twilight sounds to me like it happens later than evening, but I honestly don't use the word twilight. Okay, and I don't really know if it has a specific meaning in English. What I do know is that the word that's translated here as twilight actually literally means between the evenings, according to Young's literal translation of the Old Testament. And so we said last week that their hours of the day were a little bit different than ours. And so once the sun had passed midday and was headed down, the first evening was the time it took for the sun to go from noon to halfway down to the horizon. The second evening was the time that it took for the sun to go from halfway down all the way down to sunset. And so it's a little bit like us saying afternoon and late afternoon. But if midday was generally around noon and the average length of daylight is 12 hours, then, it's 6 hours from noon to sunset. So between the evenings is in the neighborhood of 3 p.m. All right. And so then at 6 or 7 o'clock, the sun sets. And after that, the people are to eat their Passover meal. And they're supposed to roast their lamb over an open fire with it completely intact and no broken bones. And the text says to do this on that night. But the night that has the same date for them would be the night before they killed it. So they must mean the same night, the way that we would say that. All right. And so that means that the date has changed for them. It's now the 15th of Nisan. So we all following? Any questions yet? All right. So I'm going to show you something else. If we jump down to a little bit later in Exodus chapter 12, we get to the place where Moses is telling all of the people all the stuff that God told him. So we're going to read through just this section here. But it's of interest to me that it includes everything that was in the section where God was giving Moses instructions, but it adds a few things. And I have no idea if these are things that Moses himself added, or if they're things that God told Moses, but that part got edited out somehow in the first telling, or if these are things that God inspired Moses to tell the Israelites, but didn't say in the conversation with Moses. No idea. All right, but there are some additions here. Check it out. It says, then Moses summoned all the elders of Israel, and he said to them, go at once and select the animals for your families and slaughter the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it into the blood in the basin, and put some of the blood on the top and on both sides of the doorframe. None of you shall go out of the door of your house until morning. When the Lord goes through the land to strike down the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the top and the sides of the doorframe and will pass over the doorways, and he will not permit the destroyer to enter your houses and strike you down. So there are a couple of interesting little additions there, but the one I'm going to point out is this one where Moses tells them to put the blood on the doorframe with a bunch of hyssop. All right, so again, I don't know if this is Moses's idea or God's. Doesn't matter, but this is what hyssop looks like. It's an evergreen garden herb. It's a member of the mint family. It's native all over Europe and Asia and apparently Egypt. All right, and so it can get kind of big in nature, but it was a super common thing to use as a flavoring for foods and various herbal remedies. So Moses has them using it as a paintbrush to put the blood on the door frames. And maybe because of that, hyssop becomes something that's a regular part of the cleansing rituals that were done in the tabernacle and later in the temple. And so it comes to be viewed as the agent that transfers sin or death from one thing to another. And in an almost superstitious way, the hyssop is thought to be important, almost like magic, in this transfer of guilt that happens regularly at the temple. And so when King David is repenting for the whole thing with Bathsheba and her murdered husband, he says, "Cleanse me with hyssop, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I will be whiter than snow." And so you can see that it is the hyssop itself that has come to be viewed as an important part of this process. All right? So Moses also tells the people this one a little bit later in Exodus 12. It says it must be eaten inside the house. Take none of the meat outside the house. Do not break any of the bones. The whole community of Israel must celebrate it. So they're not supposed to break any of the lamb's bones. And so while they're killing it, while they're skinning it, roasting it, eating it, the bones are supposed to stay unbroken. All right, and at this point in the game, it doesn't really say, but this seems to be related to the idea of the lamb remaining without defect, even after death. All right, anyway, the fact that it was said here and became an essential part of this observance comes to matter later. So, as all things do, the observance of Passover changes over time. And so right now, most people date the Exodus and Moses at about 1,300 years before Jesus. So that's a long time. And while some things about the observance of Passover are easily recognizable even today in reading the original instructions, there are some things that are different too. And so, like I said, Passover is one of the original 3 things that God put on the Jewish calendar. And as one of those things, it is a pilgrimage holiday. Jewish men are expected to celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem, no matter where they live. And so originally this meant that, people had to walk to Jerusalem from the surrounding area and neighboring cities and stuff. And now this means something entirely different. In the original Passover event, the lambs were basically killed in a somewhat communal way somewhere around where the people lived. But in time, all sacrifices to God had to take place at the tabernacle and then at the temple. So the Passover lamb also had to be killed at the temple and then carried home or wherever you were staying to be eaten. And man seems drawn to religion. We like to add rules to things, and then we like to be able to judge our neighbor by being more observant of the rules than they are. And the Passover is not exempt from that tendency. And so there were a few things changed or added by God over the generations. And, there were some historical circumstances that impacted the people's ability to observe Passover the way that God had instructed. But many of the things that were changed seem to be changes that people made because they thought it would be better or more meaningful because of the changes that they're making. And so one of the things that has not changed is the pilgrimage nature of this day on the calendar. All right, so this is a modern picture taken at Passover at the Western Wall. The Jewish people can't really get to the temple area. So there's a mosque there anyway. And without a temple, there can't be a Passover sacrifice, but that doesn't stop them from making the pilgrimage anyway and observing some version of the Passover celebration. All right, so let's try and take a close look at what we can figure out about what Passover looked like in the time of Christ. Okay, because of this pilgrimage thing, a city that normally had about 30,000 people in it would swell to a population of about 175,000. That's a huge influx of people. But the city expected it, okay? And they made provisions for it. But the Passover observance had changed some since the time of Moses. And so after Solomon's temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians, about 600 years before this time, the Hebrews had been taken into captivity and back to Babylon. They had no opportunity to sacrifice at the temple then. So they had to figure out another way to observe this time that was appointed by God. So they started to really emphasize the Seder. All right, the Seder is the ritualized meal that they put in place of eating the roasted, sacrificed lamb. There are symbolic foods added to the things that God told them to eat with the lamb, and there's a retelling of the Exodus story, all kinds of cool things. But they're really just a substitute for the sacrifice that the people had no way to do. And then there was a temple rebuilt. As soon as the Jewish people rebuilt Jerusalem, the new temple was usable, I think, right around 500 BC, but it was not at all like the first one. But it was okay. Okay, the temple sacrifice was back in that time. And then Herod the Great comes along and decides that part of his legacy is going to be restoring the glory of the temple. The Jewish people, though, wouldn't let him do anything that interfered with the temple sacrifice. So even though the entire structure was torn down and rebuilt, it was done in such a way that the rituals and the sacrifices continued without any gaps at all. And so it's the third building to be called the temple, but it's still called the second temple because they never stopped using the second temple. All right, and so anyway, that work was done from somewhere around 25 BC to around 10 BC. And even though temple sacrifice is back in full swing, the Jewish people had kind of become attached to the Seder meal. All right, and the religious leaders started to make it even more formalized. And so some of them were even emphasizing the importance of the Seder meal above the importance of the parts of the Passover observance that God had put in place. All right, and so, of course, it was the group of religious leaders called the Pharisees that were pushing the most to emphasize the Seder around the time of Christ. So, everyone has to select their lamb on the 10th of Nisan, remember? And now it has to be a temple-approved lamb, sold at the temple. And so thousands of lambs are brought in from the east on the 10th to take them to the temple. And so this was the procession of the lambs. It was fun, it was cool, but it was also complete chaos and mayhem. And so then there was the idea that they could have a single national lamb. You could still do your own lamb as long as you got it from the temple. But, there would be one main lamb that the high priest would sacrifice for the nation. And it became kind of a big thing. It was like a parade where they would bring this lamb down a prescribed route from Bethany, near the Mount of Olives, to the temple. The people would sing, they would wave palm branches and have a party as this little lamb is paraded by. And so the lamb would get to the temple where the priest would observe it for 4 days to make sure that the lamb didn't have any hidden defects. And then on the 14th day of Nisan, the lamb was put on a leash and it was staked near the altar so that everyone could see it. And then between the evenings at around 3 p.m., the high priest would kill the lamb and throw blood at the base of the altar. And he would say Nishlam, which is very much like saying completed. All right, so let's put all these new things and adjustments on our Passover week timeline. And so originally, they spent 4 days getting attached to the lamb with the idea that they were supposed to be checking it for defects. And now that's really what they think they're doing, okay? The national lamb is being observed for 4 days. And so let's move this text balloon down here to make room for some stuff. And then let's put here that we know the lamb was tied to the altar in the 3rd hour, or about 9 a.m. And so Many people at this point are still eating lamb for the Passover meal, but the emphasis has changed from the roasted lamb to the Seder, or the ritualized meal. And so, still with me? All right, have all this straight? I'm still adding stuff, okay? Let's point out that this day right here starts the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The 15th day of the month of Nisan is when God said that this appointment starts. So it's the first day of a 7-day appointed time with God. And, God had said that the first and the last days of this feast were to be days of special rest. This is a high Sabbath day. And so remember that regardless of when the weekly Sabbaths are, these high Sabbaths add Sabbaths to the week. So the 15th of Nisan is always a high Sabbath. So for the moment, this is where we're at. And this is what you have to understand is going on. We good? Good. Let's look at how Christ fulfilled the Passover after I get a drink. All right. There are some simple and obvious correlations between the Passover event, the Passover observance, and the way that Christ died. All right, this is by far the easiest of these appointed times of God to convince people that it was kind of foreshadowing of the event of the death of Christ. No big deal. The church has a really long tradition of pointing out parallels, inventing connections, and just recognizing that this looks like it may have been done on purpose. But in some places, I just don't think they take the correlation as far as it needs to go. And in other places, because there have been some connections invented over time, it looks like we've stressed some of the wrong things. So, I have a couple of slightly obscure historical facts to add to our timeline of Passover week. This section is somewhat extra-biblical in its sources, but the sources are very Jewish and very reliable for the information that's gathered. And so you should check out the writings of Josephus or the Mishnah if you have questions about this part. All right, we're going to talk for a second about Suda Mafsaket. So, in order to get this part, you need to understand that there were different Jewish wise men that had stronger followings in certain areas than in others. And so some of these guys were kind of soft and kind. Some of them were more rigid and strict. And depending on the area of the country that you lived in, your experience of Judaism could be remarkably different. And just like we say schools of thought, there were different schools of Judaism. And so the Jewish people who lived in Judah, that's where Jerusalem is, lived under the school of Hillel. And Beit Hillel was one of the softer, kinder variety of Jewish sages. And so living under the school of Hillel was considered somewhat lenient by the judging of most other sages at the time. And the Jewish people that lived in Galilee lived under the school of Shammai. So Beit Shammai had a more stoic affect. There was just a bit more ritual and sacrifice, but it's not like it was oppressive or wrong. It was just a different way to interpret and emphasize things. And if you read the New Testament carefully, you're going to catch glimpses of this conflict between these schools going below the surface. It's there. All right, well, Jesus and all of the disciples are from Galilee. All right, they were raised under Beit Shammai. They were all Torah-observant Jews that loved and trusted in the history and the scriptures of their God, and they followed many of the teachings, specifically of Beit Shammai. And so one of the things that the school of Shammai added to the Passover event was this thing where they consecrated all of the firstborn males. All right, so this is the opening verse of the chapter in Exodus, right after where we were reading about God giving Moses instructions for the original Passover meal. It says, "The Lord said to Moses, 'Consecrate to me every firstborn male. The first offspring of every womb among the Israelites belongs to me, whether human or animal.'" So that's a pretty solid reason to find a way to consecrate every firstborn male, okay? And the way that they did that was to spend a day doing no work. And the day that they landed on was the 24-hour period prior to the Passover meal. And so by definition, that makes the 14th day of Nisan a high Sabbath day if you are a Galilean Jew functioning under the school of Shammai. And so the only exception to doing any work was the sacrifice of the lamb at the prescribed time. And then when the sun went down, they could roast the lamb and have their Seder just like they were supposed to. But because the entire 14th was a Sabbath for them, all of their prep for the Passover meal had to be done 24 hours before any Hebrew living under the school of Hillel had to have it done. And when they got all of their preparations done on the 13th, they would have a big family meal together, and then all firstborn sons would fast until the Passover meal the next night. The firstborns would all go 24 hours from Suda Mopsiket to the Passover meal without eating or working except to kill the lamb. All right? So let's put that on our little timeline. The 14th of Nisan is a Sabbath day under the school of Shammai. So for observant Galilean Jews, the 14th is also a high Sabbath. The 15th is the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So it's a high Sabbath if you're any kind of Jew. All right? And because our heroes are Galileans, we'll point out where this big dinner of Suda Mopsiket is. All right? So this is pretty much it now for setting this up. It's time to look at what happened in the life of Jesus and how that correlates with the things that we've already talked about. All right, so we'll start by placing the weekly Sabbaths where there is the most consensus that they were on the Passover week that Christ was crucified. Easy enough. All right. Now let's take a look at this passage in John chapter 12 to try and find a place to start our clock running here. It says, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany. The next day, the great crowd that had come for the festival heard that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. They took palm branches and they went out to meet him. It says 6 days before the Passover, right? Passover is the 15th of Nisan. So as long as there's no, witchcraft or translation errors or whatever, then that puts us on the regular weekly Sabbath that Jesus came into Bethany. And then it's on the next day that he heads into Jerusalem, which puts it on the 10th of Nisan that Jesus makes his triumphal entry into the city of Jerusalem. And he did it riding on a donkey to indicate that he came in peace, and he followed the exact same path as the procession of the Lamb. And I have no idea if he came before or after the national lamb that day, but those people were already out there to welcome the symbolic lamb. They just unexpectedly bumped into the real one. All right, and so then for 4 days that the national lamb is being observed and checked for defects, what's going on in the life of Jesus? Right, we could do this all day, but here's a small example from Matthew's account of events of one of the many interactions that Jesus had that week with the religious authorities. It says the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. And after Jesus is arrested, Luke tells us that Pilate says, then Pilate announced to the chief priests and the crowd, I find no basis for a charge against this man. So Pilate sends Jesus to King Herod to see if he can find a reason to execute him, but Herod basically just sends Jesus back because he won't do any magic tricks for him. And then Pilate tells the religious leaders, I've examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. As you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. So while that lamb is being observed and checked for defects, right, as hard as they tried, no one could find a single thing that was wrong with Jesus. By any and all standards, he was found to be without defect and unblemished. All right, so there's another thing that I want to throw out there about this Galilean practice of pseudomopsychet. Because the firstborn sons would not eat again until the Passover, and because, if God had not spared them in Egypt, it would have been one of their last evening meals as a family, the literal translation of pseudomopsychet is the Last Supper. All right, it's kind of cool, right? So let's just put the Last Supper here. That would put the Garden of Gethsemane here, the arrest of Jesus here. And in Mark 15, it says that it was the third hour when they crucified him. All right, and so that means that we can put this right here. Jesus was hung on the cross after being interrogated and beaten all night at about 9 a.m. And so Mark says 9 a.m. for the crucifixion. John says noon. All right, there are a lot of what seem like little discrepancies in the text here in regard to timing. I've found satisfactory resolutions for most of them, but not all. Frankly, I didn't even try on this one. But by the time we're done here this morning, you may have a lot of questions about how I got to the place where we're going, all right? And so I'm happy to talk about it later. Anyway, Jesus is on the cross. I'm going to throw out a few more remarkable things about these hours on the cross, and then I'm also going to draw a couple more parallels between the Passover and the Passion Week. And so remember this kind of image from the original Passover event, okay? A bunch of people like to point out, right, that the reality of painting blood on your door frame with a salad topping probably looks a little bit more like this. So take that for what it's worth. But John does tell us this interesting little bit. It says, when the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes, dividing them into 4 shares, one for each of them, with the undergarment remaining. This garment was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. Let's not tear it, they said to one another. Let's decide by lot who will get it. Then Mark 15 says, at noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And at 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of those standing near heard him, they said, listen, he's calling Elijah. All right, so they've mistaken him saying Eloi for him saying Elijah. And so for whatever reason, they can't understand him. But what is he saying? All right, this is a passage that people often say proves that Jesus didn't understand that he was supposed to die, that he's just some tragic martyr figure that was suppressed by the religious elite. More devout people say that this means that, God had to turn his back on the sin that Jesus had to become, and Jesus is just overcome with the desolation of that moment. All right, but I'm pretty sure that Jesus is reciting song lyrics. Yeah, that's what I said. All right, so Jesus has a number of his followers around him as he's on the cross. And Jesus and his followers are devout, Torah-observant Jews. They know all the Psalms, and they know a bunch of the Old Testament by heart in song. And Psalm 22 is pretty universally agreed to be a messianic psalm. It was even believed to be messianic before Jesus died on the cross. All right, check out how it starts. My God, why have you forsaken me? So you understand what Jesus just did. Okay, if I say to you, somebody once told me the world is going to roll me, I ain't the sharpest tool in the shed, right? Something just happened in the brain of a whole bunch of you. Okay, you started to run through that stupid song for as far as you know it. All right. So, well, among the many of the other remarkable things that this psalm says, in verse 16, it says, dogs surround me, a pack of villains encircles me. They pierce my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment. It's kind of eerie, right? It's not a fortune cookie. It's not Nostradamus. That is strangely specific about a pretty weird and obscure thing. And this is just me talking, but it seems to me that this moment right here is the moment that Satan realizes that he has miscalculated terribly. All right, Satan knows the scriptures better than any man, and this song starts going through his head too. And he looks around and he realizes that Jesus intended to be in this place, hanging on this cross from the very beginning. The devil didn't put Jesus on the cross, right? He didn't eliminate the Messiah before he could do his work. Satan helped orchestrate the events that led directly to his final defeat. All right. This psalm ends with, they will proclaim his righteousness, declaring to a people yet unborn, he has done it. Yes, he has. All right, so then Mark tells us, someone ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down, he said. All right, so John adds this detail. A jar of wine vinegar was there, so they soaked a sponge in it, put the sponge on a stalk of the hyssop plant, and lifted it to Jesus' lips. That's kind of weird, right? You remember hyssop, right? And you remember that hyssop has come to be seen as the agent that transferred sin and guilt. So it is of course hyssop that's used to transfer the sour wine to the lips of Jesus, which would be a decent symbolic image of the, guilt of humanity being transferred to the innocent sacrifice to pay for the guilt. And so, like King David, we have been cleansed with hyssop so that we can be whiter than snow. All right. So then Mark tells us that with a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. I wonder what he cried out. Well, John, who was definitely there, tells us what Jesus said. When he had received the drink, Jesus said, it is finished. With that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. That's interesting, kind of cool. This could very well be the same as the high priest saying Nishlam, right, as he sacrifices the national lamb. Could be the last line of Psalm 22 where he says he's done it. Either of those are pretty cool. Could be both. But John writes this as a single Greek word, all right, tetelestai. Has some additional connotations. There's some significant evidence on, ancient papyrus records that this single Greek word was used across the Roman world in relation to receipts and debts. They had stamps of this word, often abbreviated, that they would stamp across receipts and debts that had been paid off. And so debtors and criminals often had what's called a certificate of debt. You'll find that Paul references this idea more than a few times in his letters to all over the ancient world. And so this certificate would list their crimes. And when they paid their debt or had done their time, they'd stamp the certificate with the Greek word tetelestai. And so Jesus actually ended up with what was essentially a certificate of debt. And when Pilate decided to write that Jesus was the King of the Jews in 3 different languages and post it on the cross with Jesus, he's essentially listing the crime that Jesus is accused of. And I don't know if you remember, but the Jewish religious leaders tried very hard to get Pilate to change the wording on this sign, but he refused. And so he ended up posting something on the cross with Jesus that was actually not a crime because it was true. So when Jesus says, it's finished. And John writes that down as Jesus saying tetelestai. He's indicating that not only is God's plan for the redemption of humanity completed, but our certificate of debt has been paid in full by the man who had nothing on his certificate of debt except the true statement that he was the King of the Jews. The Lamb is slain. The debt is paid. The plan has been executed. All things in heaven and earth have been completed. He has done it. All right? This is the central moment in the entire history of the universe. Everything pivots on this moment. All right, and so let's just go ahead and point out that Mark tells us that all of this goes down at about 3 p.m. That sound familiar? He's put on the cross in the morning. We can add to our timeline that Jesus gives up his spirit and dies on the cross between the evenings, or at about 3 p.m. Last thing that I'm going to point out, this is a pretty common one. Moses told the people that they were not supposed to break any of the bones of the lamb, right? There's no specific reason given, but the instructions were explicit. No broken bones. Hanging on the cross for a long time makes it hard to breathe. You have to pull or push yourself up in order to inhale. And you can accelerate the suffocation process by breaking the legs of the victim. So this is from John 19. This is while Jesus is on the cross. Now it was the day of preparation. The next day was to be a special Sabbath because the Jewish leaders did not want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath. They asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. The soldiers therefore came and broke the legs of the first man who had been crucified with Jesus, and then those of the other. But when they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. So maybe not a big deal, but it is a deliberate parallel that the Bible points out and that you should be aware of if you weren't already. All right. So this is pretty much all the running around and gathering information that we're going to do today. So this slide is the completed timeline for the Passover week and the National Lamb of Israel. Here's our completed timeline for the Passion Week of the Christ. All right? There's just about nothing that happens in that week that does not have an indication that God knew it was going to happen and planned for it to happen. By the time we get done studying the next 2 appointed times of God, it will be absolutely unreal how much of the events of these 8 days are predicted in just the festival calendar. The Passover is not some vague foreshadowing of the events that redeem mankind. It is a carefully planned and executed mission that was fully formed in every detail, a minimum of 1,300 years before it happened. This is the most remarkable predictive record that I have ever seen or heard of. This is the most detailed fulfillment of any prophecy ever made. This is the final apologetic for the remarkable accuracy and truth of the scriptures. All right? And of course it's true that I deliberately lined up the timelines. Okay? But I didn't make any of this up. I didn't stretch what anything says. All I did was throw out the traditional ideas that, go along with what the Bible says. All right, you're going to love this part. Here's where the Christians start throwing stones, okay? I'm sure that many of you already can see this, but let's go ahead and make it explicit. If we lay the days of the week by our names over our timeline of the Passion Week, then it starts to look like maybe something's wrong, okay? The triumphal entry happens right where it's supposed to on what we generally call Palm Sunday, all right? And I promise that I'm not going to mess with Easter. It's right where it belongs, following Sunday. But if you look at Good Friday, you'll see that there's something conspicuously absent from the things that are supposed to happen on Good Friday, all right? So allow me to introduce you to Good Thursday. Listen, this is not a new discussion. All right, people have actually been arguing about the day of the death of Jesus since very shortly after he died. And so this is broadly called the Paschal controversy. There are various reasons to believe either way. There are a couple of reasons why the argument that I've made today is the one that I prefer. Polycarp was said to be a disciple of John the Apostle. And when he weighed in on this discussion, he said that Jesus was crucified on the 14th. All right? So the other big thing for me is that in about the year 195, Pope Victor I tried to excommunicate anyone who believed that Jesus died on the 14th. All right? You may have a different view of organized religion and especially the early Catholic Church, but in my view, as soon as they start calling something heresy and excommunicating people and burning people at the stake, I start to think that they're probably wrong. Okay? And so the crux of the argument that Jesus died on Friday rests on the fact that the day after his death was clearly a Sabbath. And so all of the accounts of his death make that clear. But most all of the arguers are either unaware or just ignore that the 15th of Nisan is a high Sabbath, all right, no matter what day it falls on. And when Matthew says that Jesus was raised on the day after the Sabbath, at the beginning of Matthew 28, he uses the Greek word Shabbaton, not the word Shabbat. And so the word he uses is the word for 2 Sabbaths in a row. All right, so I don't care what you decide to believe. I absolutely encourage you to, look into this yourself. But if you decide to look into it, don't quit looking as soon as you find someone that agrees with what you want to think. Gather the information, decide for yourself. This is the biggest, coolest thing that has ever happened. All right, this is absolutely extraordinary in the level of detail that God put into predicting it and executing it. There is no way that you can say that a single human author or multiple human authors went back through time and lined up all of these things. All right? You cannot make any kind of decent case that this is coincidental. It would take unimaginable faith to believe that this is not planned and deliberate and foretold as an event. And if the reality of this is even close to what I've talked about today, then you're faced with deciding how you're going to react and what kind of effect that has on your view of God and your view of your own life. All right? And so this is the one that has the most details and is the most work, but, we're going to do the same thing for all of these. And so every one of these appointments is a prediction. They're appointments that God has with his people that are predictive and they're specific. And this one has been completely fulfilled. All right, so that's what I have for today.